Imagine a quiet afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting its warm glow over a peaceful neighborhood. People are going about their day, children laughing, neighbors exchanging pleasantries, but beneath the surface, an unseen danger is lurking, ready to strike. It's the kind of moment you never expect to change your life forever. But for one family, this was about to become a day they would never forget, a day that would shatter all their preconceived notions and forever alter the course of their story. It all started in a neighborhood just like any other. A white family, going about their usual day, had no idea that danger was closing in. They didn't know it yet, but their world was about to be turned upside down. As they were enjoying a regular afternoon, a situation began to unfold, one that would test the true meaning of humanity, trust, and what it really means to step up for someone in need. The family was going to face a life or death decision, and the last thing they expected was the person who would save them. A man, a stranger to them, appeared seemingly out of nowhere. A black man, who had no reason to get involved, no reason to risk his safety or his life. He wasn't part of their circle, he didn't know them, and yet in that moment, he did what few people might dare to do, he acted. Without hesitation, without concern for himself, he stepped in to help, completely disregarding the potential danger that could have come his way. The family watched in awe as he stepped up, doing what many would have been too scared or too cautious to do. There was a pause, a moment of disbelief as the man moved with determination, fearlessness in his eyes. The family had never imagined themselves in this kind of situation, and certainly never imagined a stranger, a black man, would be the one to save them. But here he was, changing the course of their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But what happened next would leave them and you speechless. The man's actions were heroic, yes, but the family's response? It was something that none of them could have predicted, and it would challenge everything they thought they knew about people, race, and kindness. As the immediate danger passed, the family found themselves grappling with emotions they didn't understand. They had just witnessed something that broke down barriers they never realized were there. And as they began to speak with the man, a complex and emotional conversation unfolded, one that would leave lasting impressions on all sides. There was a powerful exchange of gratitude, yes, but also a deeper realization about the ways in which society shapes our perceptions and the way we view others. As the day drew to a close, the family knew their world had changed forever. But the questions remained: how would they respond? How would they navigate the aftermath of this experience, knowing that the person who had saved them was someone society had taught them to be wary of? And the man? What were his thoughts, his feelings, as he faced a family that, just moments earlier, might have never thought twice about him? The answers to these questions and more are coming. But first, you have to ask yourself, what would you have done in that situation? Would you have stepped up? And what would have happened afterward? This is just the beginning of an unforgettable journey, one that will show you the raw power of human connection, the breaking of stereotypes, and the extraordinary things that can happen when we see each other as people, not as labels. Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world we live in. The moments after the danger had passed felt surreal. The air was thick with the kind of silence that follows an event so unexpected, so jarring, that it leaves everyone in a state of shock. The family stood frozen, watching the man who had come to their rescue. His back was to them now, but they could still see his broad shoulders tense under the weight of what had just happened. He hadn't asked for thanks. He hadn't asked for anything at all. But there was something about the way he moved, calm and purposeful, that seemed to anchor everything, giving them all a sense of reality they couldn't quite grasp yet. It hadn't been a simple altercation. The danger they'd faced was real, the kind of threat that sends shivers down your spine, that makes your blood run cold when you realize how close you came to disaster. And yet, in the midst of it all, this stranger had appeared like an angel in the chaos, seemingly out of nowhere. He had taken control of the situation with remarkable precision, his actions sharp and efficient, his calmness cutting through the panic like a knife. The family had been paralyzed, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. It was all happening so fast that they didn't know how to react until he intervened. As the danger dissipated and the weight of the moment began to settle over them, the family found themselves facing the man. He turned around, his gaze locking with theirs. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no sense of superiority, only an unspoken understanding. He had done what he had to do, and now he was waiting for something, maybe for them to thank him, maybe for some kind of acknowledgement, but it wasn't the kind of thing he would demand. He just stood there, as if his actions had been as natural as breathing, as if there was no other choice. It was the father of the family who spoke first. His voice trembled slightly, unsure of what to say, but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his words hanging in the air between them, but they felt almost inadequate. He knew it wasn't enough. This man had saved their lives, and all he could offer was a simple thank you. The words didn't seem to capture the depth of the moment, the weight of what had just unfolded. The man nodded, a brief movement of acknowledgement, but he didn't say anything in return. There was no need to. He hadn't done this for recognition, and it seemed like the family understood that. But the silence between them grew thick, pregnant with something that none of them could yet name. What do you say to someone who's saved your life? How do you even begin to comprehend the complexities of what just happened? For a moment, no one spoke. The family exchanged glances, their faces pale, their minds still processing the rapid sequence of events. The mother's eyes were wide, searching the stranger's face, trying to read him, trying to understand him. Her heart was racing, not just from the adrenaline of the ordeal, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being saved by someone they never would have expected. The children, still young and innocent, seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation in a way that only children can. They had witnessed the fear in their parents' eyes, the confusion and worry, and yet they'd also seen the man step in with a strength and courage that was hard for them to process. But there was a shift in the way they looked at him, something beyond gratitude, something almost like curiosity. Who was this man? Why had he risked everything for them? Why had he, a stranger, stepped into a situation that wasn't his to fix? The man, still standing in front of them, remained quiet, allowing them their moment. He wasn't looking for their praise, wasn't asking for their understanding. His eyes were soft but distant, as if he was already somewhere else, his thoughts far removed from the family in front of him. He had done what he needed to do, and now, he was ready to move on. But the family wasn't ready to let go. The tension in the air was palpable. There was a sense that something more was waiting to be said, something unsaid that needed to be addressed. The mother spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "Why? Why did you help us?" she asked, her question simple but full of weight. The man looked at her for a long moment before answering, his gaze steady but unreadable. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said, his voice low but resolute. There was no trace of hesitation, no doubt in his words. It was as if the answer was self-evident, and for him, it had never been a question. But the family wasn't satisfied. They needed more, something deeper, something that would make sense of the chaos they had just experienced. They were desperate for answers, for an explanation that would justify their confusion. Before they could press further, a distant noise broke the tension, a siren, faint but growing louder. The police were coming. The family's attention shifted, the reality of the situation beginning to settle back in. The danger was over, but there were still consequences to face. The authorities would have questions. They would want to know what had happened, who had been involved, and what had led to the confrontation. The man's eyes flicked toward the sound of the approaching sirens. He didn't seem concerned, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, a decision being made, perhaps. Without a word, he began to move away, walking briskly down the street, his footsteps fading into the distance. The family stood there, unsure of what to do next. They had just witnessed an act of heroism, something so rare and unexpected, and now they were left with more questions than answers. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on them, but they didn't know how to process it all. They had been saved, yes, but by whom? And why? What had just happened? As they stood there, still in shock, the sirens grew louder. The police were almost there, and they had to make a choice: tell the authorities the truth, tell them about the man who had appeared out of nowhere and saved their lives, or leave out the details, keep the mystery intact. What would they say when the officers asked how they had managed to escape the danger? Would they tell them about the black man who had stepped in, or would they try to explain it away? It was a dilemma none of them had expected. They had been saved, but now they had to grapple with the complexity of the situation, the emotions swirling within them, the questions they didn't know how to ask, and the strange, lingering feeling that they had witnessed something profound. It wasn't just about the danger or the rescue. It was about something deeper. Something about the way we see each other, the assumptions we make, and how easily those assumptions can be shattered in a single moment of truth. As the family made their decision, the man who had saved them vanished into the shadows. The sirens were closer now, and the family knew their time for reflection was running out. What they didn't know was that this encounter, this moment, was far from over. What they didn't know was that they had only just begun to understand the full weight of the man's actions, and what his presence in their lives would mean for them moving forward. For now, though, the answers they sought were still elusive. And with each passing second, the tension grew, as the family stood at a crossroads, uncertain of how to move forward, yet knowing that their lives would never be the same again. The police arrived not long after the man disappeared, their flashing lights casting bright, erratic reflections across the street. The family, still standing together on the sidewalk, could feel the weight of their silence. The tension between them hung thick, like a storm cloud about to burst. The officers stepped out of their cars, their faces serious, accustomed to dealing with emergencies and chaotic scenes. But this was different. This was not just an emergency, it was something that didn't fit the mold of what they were used to handling. The father spoke first, his voice unsteady. "We were just attacked," he explained, still trying to collect his thoughts. The adrenaline from the past few minutes hadn't completely worn off, and his words felt jumbled. A group of men, he paused, trying to remember the details, but they were blurry. It was all a blur. The man who had saved them had been so quick, so decisive, that everything else seemed secondary. There was a man who stepped in. He saved us. His voice cracked slightly. The officers exchanged glances, the skepticism on their faces hard to miss. They were used to hearing about heroes, but this wasn't a typical story. The family didn't look like they'd been in a violent altercation, no visible bruises or injuries. The mother, who had been the most shaken, stepped forward to elaborate. "He just appeared out of nowhere. We don't know who he is, but he handled the situation before we could even react." "Can you describe him?" one of the officers asked. His tone was neutral, but there was a hint of disbelief behind his question. The family looked at one another, their faces still clouded with confusion. The description felt inadequate. He wasn't just a man, they weren't sure how to convey the profound sense of relief that had washed over them when he stepped in. "Black," the father finally said, his voice a little steadier now. "Tall. Strong. He didn't ask for anything. Just acted." The words felt like they fell flat in the face of what had actually happened. How do you describe someone who, without any obligation, stepped into the unknown to protect a family he didn't know? The officer nodded slowly, taking mental notes. But his expression didn't change. "We'll need to file a report, and we'll look into it," he said, but the words didn't feel reassuring. There was something in his tone that made it clear he was thinking about other things, the usual procedures, the routine of things, the formalities. To him, this was just another case to be handled, another crime to be solved. The family could sense it. There was a gulf between the experience they'd just gone through and the way the police were processing it. They were still in shock, still caught in that strange limbo of gratitude and confusion. They were beginning to piece together the events, but everything felt fragmented. The mystery of the man who had saved them loomed larger than ever. They kept wondering, who was he really? And why had he done it? As the officers continued to ask routine questions, the family's focus drifted. The mother's eyes were distant, her thoughts far away. She couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something beyond the incident itself. The man had appeared out of nowhere, just as danger loomed. That couldn't have been a coincidence. There was something more at work, something beyond fate or luck. Her thoughts were interrupted by the youngest child tugging at her sleeve. The child's eyes were wide with innocence and curiosity. But there was something else there, too, a question that didn't seem to fit a child's mind. "Mom, why did he help us?" the child asked, the simple question feeling like a weight. The mother blinked, as if hearing the question for the first time. She had been asking herself that same thing ever since the man had left. Why him? Why had he risked his life for them, a family he didn't know? There was no easy answer to that, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. She glanced at her husband, hoping he might offer some clarity. But he was just as lost as she was. "Maybe he was just a good person," the father said softly, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't enough. The feeling in his chest, the unease that had settled in after the man disappeared, was too strong to be dismissed with a simple answer like that. He couldn't shake the thought that something had shifted, something profound had occurred, but he couldn't understand it yet. It didn't make sense. Back inside their house, after the police had left, the family sat around the kitchen table in silence. The father poured himself a glass of water, the sound of the liquid filling the cup almost too loud in the quiet room. The mother stared out the window, lost in thought. The children were unusually quiet, the excitement of the afternoon's chaos turning into a heavy, unspoken question in the air. Then, the doorbell rang. The father went to answer it, not knowing what to expect. As he opened the door, he was met with the figure of the man who had saved them. He wasn't expecting him, he hadn't asked for him to return. But there he was, standing on the doorstep as if it was the most normal thing in the world. The man didn't say anything at first. He just looked at the father, his gaze steady and calm, as if he had anticipated this moment. The father's heart skipped a beat. You're back?" he said, his voice betraying his surprise. The man nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I had to make sure you were all right," he said, his voice low but firm. There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that only deepened the mystery of who he was and what had driven him to act. The father stepped aside, silently inviting him into the house. Inside, the man stood by the door, his eyes scanning the room quickly, as if assessing the situation, but his body language remained closed off. He wasn't here to explain himself. He wasn't here to fill in the gaps in their understanding. He was just there. The father found himself struggling for words. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, filled with the questions that had been swirling in his mind all evening. "Why did you help us?" The man's gaze softened for just a moment before he spoke again, his words measured, as if he was trying to decide how much to reveal. "Because I couldn't stand by and do nothing," he said quietly, his eyes locking with the father's. "I've seen too much of that already. People turning away when they should step in. I won't be one of those people." The father wanted to say more, but the words wouldn't come. He wanted answers, but it felt like the man was giving him a glimpse of something deeper, something more complicated than a simple act of kindness. Before the father could respond, the man turned, as if he had said all he needed to say. "I have to go," he said simply, his voice final. And just like that, he was gone, disappearing into the night as silently as he had arrived. The family was left in stunned silence once again. The questions only multiplied. Who was he really? What did he mean by seeing too much of people turning away? And why had he come back? The mystery of the man lingered in their minds long after he was gone, and as they sat there, waiting for clarity that never seemed to come, they realized that their encounter with him was far from over. The truth they were searching for was just beyond their reach, and they could feel the tension building, the answers waiting, hidden just beneath the surface. The days that followed felt like they stretched on forever, each moment dragging with the weight of uncertainty. The family tried to return to normal, but it wasn't the same. The incident had carved a mark into their lives, something they couldn't shake off. Every time the father looked out the window, he half expected to see the man walking down the street again, as if fate would once again pull him into their lives. But he never came. The mother couldn't stop thinking about him. His quiet words, his calm presence. I couldn't stand by and do nothing. Those words kept echoing in her mind, haunting her thoughts. What had he meant by that? What kind of life had he lived to make him so certain that helping was the only option? And why had he chosen to step in when no one else had? The family was divided on how to move forward. The father tried to focus on the practical, filing the report with the police, dealing with the lingering sense of unease. But every time the officers came back with questions, every time they asked if anyone knew the man or had seen him before, he couldn't give them a clear answer. They were getting more frustrated with the lack of information, their skepticism turning into doubt. The mother, on the other hand, felt a deep, nagging sense of responsibility. She couldn't let this go. She had to know more, to understand what had really happened, why the man had stepped into their lives so suddenly, and why he had disappeared just as quickly. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, the mother sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. The air was thick with something she couldn't quite place, a tension that felt out of place in the stillness. It wasn't just the uncertainty of not knowing who had saved them. It was something more. She couldn't explain it, but she knew deep down that something was coming, something that would force them to confront everything they'd been avoiding. A knock on the door shattered the silence. The father answered, his face clouded with confusion. There, standing in the doorway, was the man again. His expression was grim, his face etched with a seriousness that the family hadn't seen before. This wasn't the same man who had stepped in to save them. There was something darker about him now, something heavy hanging in the air between them. I need to talk to you, the man said, his voice low and urgent. There was no greeting, no pleasantries. He was here for a reason, and the family could feel it in the pit of their stomachs. The father hesitated, his mind racing with questions. What now? Why was he back? What had changed in the few days since they'd last seen him? But before he could say anything, the man stepped into the house, his presence filling the room. I need your help, he said, looking directly at the father, his gaze sharp and unwavering. There was a desperation in his voice, but also a warning, like he was trying to decide whether he could trust them with the truth. The mother was already on edge, her mind spinning with possibilities. What kind of help did he need? And why had he come to them? It wasn't like they had a history, no reason for him to confide in them now. But the man didn't wait for them to ask. There are people after me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. People who don't like what I've done. I've been trying to lay low, trying to stay out of their way. But I can't anymore. It's gotten too dangerous. The words hit them like a punch to the gut. The father's heart skipped a beat. This was not what he had expected. It wasn't just about a random act of heroism. This was bigger, something deeper, more complicated than they could have imagined. What do you mean, people after you? The father asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone was listening, his eyes darting around the room. He stepped closer, lowering his voice even more. There's a network of people who think what I've done is a threat to them. They won't stop until they've silenced me. And they won't stop coming for anyone I've helped. The family exchanged looks, their confusion deepening into fear. This wasn't just a chance encounter, a random act of bravery. This man was running from something. And now, by virtue of him saving them, they were involved in whatever this dangerous game was. "What do you want from us?" the mother asked, her voice tight with anxiety. The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "I need a place to hide," he said, his tone pleading but still commanding. "Just for a few days. Just long enough to get them off my trail." The father opened his mouth to refuse, but the words caught in his throat. What could they do? This was no longer just about a heroic stranger stepping in at the right moment. They were now tied to something bigger, something dangerous, and the uncertainty of the situation gripped them like a vice. Could they really help him? Could they risk their own safety for someone they didn't even know? The tension in the room was palpable. The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had silently crept to the hallway, their eyes wide, watching from the shadows. They could feel it too, the tension, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. They were not just passive bystanders anymore, they were caught in something that was spiraling out of control. The man, seeing their hesitation, stepped closer to the father, his voice growing more urgent. "Please," he said. "I don't have anywhere else to go. You don't understand. If they find me, it won't just be me they come after. They'll come for you too. They'll come for your family." His eyes locked onto the father's with a plea that cut deeper than any words could express. The father felt his resolve weakening. He glanced at the mother, who was silent, her face pale. She was terrified, but there was something else there too, something that pushed her to think beyond the immediate danger. Could they really turn him away? Could they live with the knowledge that they might have been able to help and chose not to? And if they did help him, would they all end up paying the price? The man was running out of time. The family could feel the clock ticking, the air thick with the sound of their own indecision. And in that moment they knew, no matter what they decided, there would be no going back. The decision would change everything. Would they take him in, risk their lives, and become part of whatever dangerous web this man was tangled in? Or would they send him away, sealing their fate by choosing safety over responsibility? The door creaked open suddenly. Was it the wind? Or was someone out there, listening? And then, from the darkness outside, a figure appeared, stepping into the faint light cast by the hallway. The family froze. The man who had been standing in their doorway, pleading for their help, stiffened at the sight of the figure emerging from the darkness. His eyes flickered to the window, then to the door, and back again, his body taut with alarm. The room seemed to close in around them, the air thick with a sense of impending danger. The figure in the doorway was tall, but unlike the man who had saved them, this one exuded a cold confidence, a sense of authority that was impossible to ignore. The face was partially obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the deliberate, measured steps that carried him into the light. The man who had once been their savior took a step back, a strange flicker of fear crossing his face. "I told you I would find you," the figure said, his voice low and menacing. It was calm, too calm, and yet it sent a chill through the room. The tension in the air grew unbearable, thick enough to suffocate them all. The family stood, paralyzed, unable to move or speak. They hadn't seen this man before, but the presence he carried was unmistakable. It was the kind of authority that commanded attention, that made the room feel too small, the walls too close. His eyes locked onto the man who had been pleading for their help, and for the first time, the family saw fear not from them, but from their supposed savior. "You think you can outrun me?" The figure continued, his words dripping with disdain. You think hiding behind these people will protect you? His eyes flicked to the family, a look of cold calculation settling over him as he took in their shocked faces. You're all in danger now. The man who had come to them for refuge stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he ran it over his face. I didn't have a choice, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He turned to the father, eyes wide with desperation. You have to trust me. They'll kill us all if we don't do something. The family was caught in the crossfire, their sense of security crumbling with every passing second. The father felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea who this new man was or what kind of danger he posed, but the sheer certainty in his voice made it impossible to ignore. Something much darker than he had anticipated was happening, and they were all entangled in it now. The figure stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. You've made a mistake, letting him into your home, he said coldly. And now you'll pay the price. The mother, still standing by the window, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The strange unease that had been gnawing at her since the night of the attack surged back. Was this man part of whatever dangerous group the other man had spoken about? Or was he something even worse? She looked to her husband, his face drawn and pale, and knew that this was a decision that would change everything. There was no going back now. The danger was real, and it was right in front of them. And yet she couldn't help but wonder who was telling the truth? The man who had saved them, or this new, ominous figure who seemed so sure of his power? The tension in the room was unbearable, each heartbeat louder than the last. The children were still peering from the hallway, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The mother could hear the softest sounds of movement behind her, and for a fleeting moment she wondered if there were more people outside, more figures lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, without warning, the figure who had been standing in their doorway moved with lightning speed, stepping past the father and grabbing the man who had once been their protector by the throat. The family gasped in unison, a collective breath caught in their throats. The man's eyes widened in shock as the figure squeezed, his body jerking against the invisible pressure. But he didn't fight back, not in the way the family expected. There was no struggle, no desperate attempt to break free. Instead, he remained eerily still, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. I've been tracking you for too long, the figure hissed, his voice low and threatening. You thought you could outrun me, hide from me. But now you've dragged others into this mess. He tightened his grip, and the man let out a strangled gasp, his hands futilely reaching for the other man's wrist. Please, the father said, his voice shaking, as he took a step forward. Let him go. You don't have to do this. The figure turned to him slowly, as if weighing his words. For a moment, there was silence, thick and heavy in the air. Then, with a quick, almost dismissive motion, the figure released the man and shoved him aside, sending him crashing into the wall. Don't try to stop me, he warned, his gaze turning cold and calculating as he looked at the father. You have no idea what you're dealing with. You've opened a door that you can't close. The family stood frozen, caught between the two men, one who had saved them, and one who had come to destroy everything they had tried to build. The mystery was deepening, but the answers they sought seemed more elusive than ever. The man who had saved them struggled to his feet, his face bruised but his resolve still strong. He looked at the father, his eyes desperate. You have to believe me. I didn't want to bring this danger to your door. But I had no choice. They'll keep coming, and they'll stop at nothing. You can't just walk away from this. The father felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Could they truly trust this man who had entered their lives so unexpectedly? Or would they risk everything by helping him, only to find themselves caught in a web of lies and danger? Before he could respond, the figure turned away, his face hardening. This isn't over, he said, his voice low but full of menace. and you're not safe yet." With that, he stepped back into the night, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The silence that followed was deafening, the house now feeling smaller, darker, as if it were closing in around them. The family stood there, breathless, uncertain. What had just happened? And what was coming next? The man who had saved them was now on the floor, his eyes closed, his body trembling. It was clear that whatever had happened between the two men was far from over. The danger wasn't just outside, it was already inside their walls. The suspense was building to a breaking point. What would happen next? Would they be forced to choose sides? Or would they finally uncover the truth behind the dangerous world they had been thrust into? The room was eerily quiet after the figure disappeared into the night. The family stood frozen, trying to process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded in their living room. The air felt thick with tension, every breath heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The man who had come to them for help was on the floor, his body still trembling, but there was something in his eyes that made the father hesitate. He wasn't just afraid of the man who had threatened him, he was afraid of something much bigger. The father knelt down beside him, trying to help him sit up, but the man waved him off weakly. "It's not over," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "They'll be back." His eyes darted to the window, and the father followed his gaze, but the street outside was empty. It was hard to shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something worse. The mother paced the room, her thoughts racing. What does he mean? Who are these people? What kind of trouble are we really in? Her voice was filled with a mixture of fear and frustration. The answers they had gotten so far only led to more questions, and the tension inside the house was mounting. The children had retreated to their rooms, sensing the danger, their young minds unable to grasp the full extent of the chaos unfolding around them. The father glanced at the door, wondering if the figure would return, but there was only silence. "I didn't want this," the man on the floor finally spoke, his voice barely audible. "But I had no choice. I thought I could outrun them. Thought I could hide. But they know where I am now. And they'll stop at nothing to find me." The father, still kneeling beside him, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What had he gotten his family into? Was helping this man a mistake? Or had it been their only option? "I don't understand," the mother said, her voice trembling. "If you're running from someone, why did you come to us? Why us?" She looked at him, her eyes full of suspicion and confusion. The man looked up at her, his face pale and strained. "Because I trust you," he said simply. His words didn't make sense, but there was a depth to them that hinted at something more. Something he wasn't ready to explain. For a moment, the family stood in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the decision pressed on them, but there was no easy answer. Trust had been shattered, and yet, in some strange way, it still lingered in the air. The father stood up, his mind made up. "We need to know everything," he said, his voice firm but filled with uncertainty. "If we're going to help you, we need to understand who's after you and why. We can't keep running blind." The man nodded, his eyes dark with regret. "I'll tell you everything. But not here. Not now." He glanced nervously at the window again, as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "We need to go. We need to move." The family exchanged uneasy glances. The fear in the man's eyes was palpable, and they knew that if they didn't act fast, things could spiral out of control. The father looked at his wife, and without a word, they made a decision. They would leave. At least for now, they had no choice. The man got to his feet, still shaky but determined. "We need to get to a place that's safe. Somewhere they won't think to look." The family gathered their things, each movement stiff with the weight of the decision. As they prepared to leave, the tension in the air grew thicker, like the calm before a storm. They knew this was just the beginning, but they had no idea what would happen next. The father opened the door, peering out into the night, scanning the street. There was no sign of the figure. But they couldn't take any chances. They stepped outside, the cold air biting at their skin as they walked quickly to the car. The man who had come to them for help led the way, his eyes constantly scanning for any sign of danger. As they drove away from their home, the father couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just a feeling, it was instinct. Every street they passed, every turn they made, the uncertainty grew. Were they being followed? Would the danger catch up with them before they could find safety? But as they drove deeper into the city, something unexpected happened. The man who had saved them, who had been so desperate for their help, suddenly turned to face them. There was a look of calm on his face, one that had not been there before. "You made the right choice," he said softly, his eyes meeting the father's. "But there's something I need to tell you." The father's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean? What else are you hiding?" The man didn't answer immediately. He stared out the window, his expression distant, as if weighing his next words carefully. Then, finally, he spoke. "The people I'm running from," he began, his voice quieter now, "they're not after me. They're after you." The words hit the father like a blow to the chest. His mind raced to process what he had just heard. "What? That doesn't make sense. We didn't do anything to." "I know," the man interrupted, his voice tense. "You didn't. But you're connected to this now. You can't escape it. They've been watching you, waiting for the right moment. And now that you've helped me, you've sealed your fate." The mother gasped, her face pale. "No, that can't be right. We haven't done anything wrong." The man turned to face them, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and determination. "It doesn't matter what you've done. It's what you'll do next that matters. If you want to survive, you need to keep moving. Keep running. They won't stop until they get what they want." The father's heart raced. It was all too much too fast. "Who are they? What do they want from us?" But before the man could answer, the car screeched to a halt. The sound of a loud crash echoed from behind them. The family turned around, their eyes wide with shock. In the distance, the shadowy figure they had encountered earlier was standing in the middle of the road, a smile curling at the corners of his mouth. And in that moment, the father realized the truth: the danger wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the figure moved toward them, the father's mind raced. He had trusted the wrong person. But it was too late now. The final twist was here. And it was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The father's hands gripped the steering wheel with a strength he didn't know he had. The figure standing in the middle of the road grew larger in the rearview mirror, each step bringing him closer, his expression unreadable in the dim streetlights. The cold sweat that had been building on the father's brow turned to ice. The whole world felt as if it were closing in on them. Behind him, the man who had once been their supposed savior seemed to shrink into the seat. His eyes, once filled with fire, were now hollow, and the weariness in his voice was unmistakable. "They've found us," he muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on the figure behind them. "This is it." The mother, clutching the armrest, turned to her husband with wide eyes. "What do we do? What does he want with us?" The father swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had thought they were leaving the danger behind when they'd left their house, but now it was clear there was no running from it. The danger wasn't just chasing them, it was already within their reach. "Don't stop," the man beside them said urgently. "Keep driving. No matter what." But it was too late to outrun the truth. The figure in the rearview mirror was too close. The man in the back seat had been right. The moment they had helped him, they had crossed a line there was no turning back. The family was in this now, whether they wanted to be or not. The father's foot pressed harder on the gas pedal, but the figure was gaining on them, his movements smooth, calculated, like a predator closing in on its prey. The car was too slow, too vulnerable. The night around them felt suffocating, each turn they took leading them deeper into a world of shadows they couldn't escape. The man beside them spoke again, his voice low. They won't stop until they get what they want. They're not after me anymore. They're after you. You're in the middle of something bigger than you can understand. The mother shot a glance at him, eyes wide with disbelief. Who are they? The man didn't answer immediately. He was looking out the back window, his eyes scanning the dark road behind them. They're part of a group, a network. They have connections, power. I tried to get away from them, but they've been tracking me for years. I thought I could outrun them, but I was wrong. The moment you helped me, you became targets. They think you're involved in something you're not. The father felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just some random attack, some random danger they had stumbled into. This was orchestrated. There was something far larger at play here, something that had been set into motion long before they even knew it. We can't outrun this, the father said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. The realization was sinking in. They were in over their heads. What do we do? The man beside him finally looked at him, his face weary. But there was a flicker of something, hope, maybe, or perhaps just the last remnants of his resolve. We fight. But not here. Not on these streets. We need to find a place where we can regroup, think this through. The car was picking up speed now, but the figure behind them was relentless. There was no way they could outrun him. The father knew they couldn't keep running forever, that they had to face this head on. But where? How? Ahead, the city seemed to stretch out before them, dark and unfamiliar. It was a maze of streets and alleys that offered no clear escape. He couldn't risk driving into a dead end or getting trapped in unfamiliar territory. But he knew one thing for certain: they couldn't just keep driving forever. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The weight of their decisions, their involvement in something much bigger than themselves, pressed down on the family like a ton of bricks. But there was still one thing they had: each other. The father looked at his wife, her face pale with fear, but there was something in her eyes, something strong, something he hadn't noticed before. She wasn't just scared. She was determined. They weren't giving up. They were in this together. Keep going, the mother said firmly, her voice steady, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as the father. We'll find a way out of this. We can't just let fear control us. He nodded, feeling a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. Whatever this was, they would face it together. He would protect his family, no matter the cost. And just as the figure behind them began to close in, the man in the back seat suddenly spoke up again. Take the next left. There's a warehouse. It's a safe house, but we have to hurry. They're getting too close. The father didn't hesitate. He made a sharp left turn, feeling the tires screech as the car slid onto a new street. They were leaving behind the main road now, heading into a maze of narrow alleys and forgotten corners of the city. There were no signs, no lights to guide them. Just darkness. As they drove through the winding streets, the father's mind raced. This safe house was their only chance. If they could just make it there, maybe, just maybe, they could figure out how to end this. The man who had been their savior, who had now become their guide, wasn't just a random person. He knew what he was doing. He had to. They finally reached the warehouse, its steel door dark and imposing in the night. The father pulled up to the entrance, but before he could stop the car, the man beside him told him to keep going. Don't stop until we're inside. Trust me. The father did as he was told, his mind spinning. He could hear the sound of footsteps now, echoing in the alley behind them. There was no time to waste. The moment they stopped, they would be trapped. The moment the car came to a halt inside the warehouse, the man in the back seat was out of the car in a flash, leading the way. The family scrambled up behind him, their eyes darting around the dark, empty space. The man grabbed a key from his pocket and unlocked a side door, motioning for them to follow. They moved quickly, almost instinctively. There was no time to question their safety, no time to think about what was happening outside. They just had to get inside. The door slammed shut behind them, and the family was left in the dark. The man flipped a switch, and dim light flooded the room, revealing a set of metal stairs leading down into a basement. "Down there," the man said, his voice low. "It's secure. For now." The family descended into the basement, the cold concrete floor beneath their feet a stark contrast to the warmth of their home. The heavy door above them closed with a final, resounding thud, and the silence that followed was deafening. They were safe. For now. The man paced nervously, his mind working in overdrive. "They'll be here soon. You need to understand they'll stop at nothing. This isn't just a game to them. It's about power. Control." The father, now more resolute than ever, took a deep breath. "Tell us everything. We need to know who they are and how to stop them." The man paused, glancing at the family. His eyes were filled with a mix of regret and resolve. "You're not just involved. You're part of something bigger. This was never about me. It was always about you." And in that moment, the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The family had been drawn into a game far more dangerous than they had realized. But together they would face it head-on, fighting for their future, for their safety, and for each other. And as the man continued to explain the truth of what had been happening all along, the family finally understood. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The rest of the night passed in a blur of preparation, planning, and urgency. The family sat together, their resolve strengthening with every passing minute. The man, now their reluctant guide, shared everything he knew about the group that had been hunting them. But just as they began to piece together the puzzle, they heard a noise from above, the sound of footsteps growing closer. The final twist was upon them. And this time, they wouldn't be running. They would face it. Together.